Where's my sound technician? Otherwise known as my brother.
Over here.
Okay.
Okay, and then, how's this sound like this? Can you hear me okay? If I talk like this, is it too loud? It is too loud. Can you turn it down just a little bit? Okay. Are you turning me down? Okay. How about like this? How's that? If I talk loud like this, is it too much?
No.
If I talk softly like this, is it too soft?
Too soft.
That's too soft, so just up a little bit. Up a little bit? Can you turn it up a little bit? Okay, how's this? Too loud? Too soft? All right. Now, you got a nice picture, but it's so dark I can't find it. All right. Okay, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I think you're going to enjoy this talk, and I think it's going to be somewhat surprising for you as well. The title of the talk is Beyond Susan B. And when we talk about Susan B., most people know reference to what's sometimes known as the big three of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Rochester's own Susan B. Anthony. That's kind of interesting because there was this big revolution in women's rights. And these are the figures that are spoken of. But it's a funny thing because when we speak about another revolution that was actually much shorter than the revolution for women's rights that was over 100 years, like the American Revolution, we don't just have a big three. I mean, we don't say, well, there was Franklin, and then there was Adams, and there was Jefferson, and that was it. We have a real lot of different founding fathers, right? I mean, there's these people like Madison in there, and Alexander Hamilton, and all these Washington, all these other figures. Yet, when we talk about the women's rights revolution, we only talk about those three, where in reality, there were a lot of different women involved on this particular revolution for over 100 years. So why is it we just got the big three? Interesting question. That's because when people were researching anything having to do with women's rights and writing different textbooks and history books, there wasn't a lot of work and research done on women's rights. And all the different textbook writers and history book writers used to go to the exact same source. It was an encyclopedia called The History of Women's Suffrage. And that's the reference source they used. And lo and behold, who wrote this reference source? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and also Matilda Gage. You don't hear much about her, but she mostly wrote stuff. And because they wrote it, who turns out to be the focal point and heroes of the women's rights movement? The big three. And they tended to kind of argue at times with many other of their brethren. And the people that they argued with sometimes don't appear in here or get a very short shrift. People like Lucy Stone and others are hardly mentioned. So, it's not surprising that we have this focus on the big three, but I think it's time that we went about correcting this and talked about some of the other women beyond these big three, beyond Susan B., that are responsible for helping us establish women's rights and suffrage in this country. So, let's start actually with a couple members of the big three, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they met for the first time when they were attending with their husbands the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention over in London. And when they got to London, these two ladies were very, very much put off by the fact that they were not allowed to sit on the main floor with the men. All the women could not sit on the main floor. They had to sit up in a special spot in the gallery. And they didn't think this was right at all. So they started speaking, and they started to become fast friends. And the way they kind of broke the ice was similar to the way people break the ice today when you meet somebody new. You know, if you're sitting next to them on an airplane or what have you, or a call like this, you say, oh, did you see something on TV last night? Or did you see this particular movie that was out? Well, in those days, they didn't have movies and television. What they talked about was a book. And they had both read a particular book that they were very excited about, and they started talking away on this book, and that's one of the things that cemented their friendship. And that book was written by Mary Wollstonecraft. If you're going to be famous, it's nice to have a beautiful name. She had a beautiful name, Mary Wollstonecraft. And the book that she wrote was called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And today, this book is seen as a seminal work in feminist and women's rights theory. And she is unofficially christened in many circles and feminist studies as the mother of women's rights. Now, her story starts over in England, over on the western coast of England, to be exact, over in Liverpool, back in 1759. And this illustration would be typical of what was happening in her household. Her father was a drunk, a brute, and a wife-beater of the worst sort. And there were many occasions where it was very similar to what's pictured here, that she was between her mother and her father trying to protect her mother from physical violence. And this was very stressful on Mary when she was growing up. And fortunately, there were some kindly neighbors that lived some blocks away in a nicer area. And they would give Mary some refuge and grace in their home, because Mary especially liked to go to their large library. And she spent many, many hours in this library. She read every book on every shelf several times, and was extremely well self-educated as a result. Philosophy, history, economics. She taught herself to read and write several different languages. So even though she was well educated, self-educated, it still was very limited in employment opportunities when she got older, because even if she did have some formal education, it would be limited. A woman of a good education maybe only had very few things available. She could be what's called an elder companion. In those days, the wealthy people didn't have like nursing homes and assisted living centers. You would have a live-in nurse. And if you were wealthy, you would get a live-in nurse that was well educated, that could read to you and have stimulating intellectual conversations. Or you could be a school teacher, or you could be a private school teacher in a household, be a governess. So she decided she should be a school teacher. Now, when Mary grew up, she had a very close childhood friend by the name of Fanny Blood, who later became Mary Fanny Blood Skies. And even though they were the bosom buddies and very close growing up, in many ways they were mirror opposites as people. Mary Wollstonecraft was a very creative and intelligent, but she was also could be sometimes over-emotional, very, very compulsive person, somewhat obsessive at times. And Fanny, her friend, was the opposite. She was a real down-to-earth, practical person, and she was the one who always kind of grounded Mary. And she'd be always saying to Mary, hey, Mary, wake up and smell the coffee here, all right? So when Mary came with this scheme about being a school teacher, Fanny said right away, well, we're going to get no place there. I mean, they give school teachers dirt for wages and even lower for women school teachers. And your jobs are, what we need to do is form our own school. That's the only way we're going to be able to call our own shots here and bring in some money. So they formed their own school, brought in another gal to teach as well, the three of them, and they got a lot of wealthy families to bring their children in, and they were doing well. They were all teaching courses in the school, the enrollment was climbing, and they were being somewhat prosperous with the school. Now, Fanny got married when they started the school, and when she got pregnant and gave birth to her child, unfortunately, she died in childbirth, which was quite a tragedy. And we'll see later that Mary really could have used Fanny around to tell her to wake up and smell the coffee at different points in her life. But the school, without Fanny's leadership, the school wound up folding, and Mary was without a job and without a close friend. So she decided to stay in teaching, but she decided she'll take the other avenue and become a governess. And since she had connections with wealthy people, they were teaching all of these wealthy kids in the school, she got a very good appointment to be the governess for Lady Caroline Kingsborough, quite an elaborate aristocratic family over in England. And even though she went into the high-end family and she was supposed to be the teacher of their children, they treated her there no better than the scullery maids. And this chafed Mary to no end, and she thought she was better educated and knew more than these aristocrats, yet they treated her like dirt. But she was able to make some very good social connections while she was in this household, especially with this gentleman, Reverend Richard Price. He held a very famous dinner that was held over in the London area, and it was called the Dinner Table of the Centres. And he invited all the leading writers, philosophers, politicians, and artists of the area to join these dinners for these stimulating discussions. And Richard Price invited Mary to some of these dinners because he was impressed with her. And Mary got in these dinners, and she did more than hold her own in discussions with the intellectuals of England because she was so well self-educated. While she was at one of these dinners, she caught the eye of a publisher, Joseph Johnson. And he was quite impressed with her. And he said, "Mary, why don't you leave your job as a governess and come work for me? They treat you like dirt there anyhow. I'll give you some work. You could do some editorial work, and you could do some translation because you could read and write these different languages into some articles in French and German so I could publish them." So she started to go and work for this publisher, which she enjoyed a lot. Now, the Reverend Price, who invited her to those dinners originally, wanted to publish his pamphlet through that publisher, and he wrote a pamphlet that was defending the French Revolution, saying that, the French Revolution they got going over there, it's justified because the aristocracy there was treating those peasants horribly. Well, as soon as this pamphlet got published, all the fellow aristocracy in high society pilloried Richard Price, Reverend Richard Price. How dare you put some garbage out like this? And of course, the last thing the aristocracy wanted to see was the people of England revolt against them, so you can understand why they were upset. But they made Richard Price an outcast among them for writing this. And Mary felt very, very bad for her friend that invited her to these dinners and got her away from this governess job. So she asked the publisher if she could put out a little pamphlet defending his views. And he said, okay, we'll do it, we'll publish it anonymously, and it's going to get into trouble. So she put out a pamphlet called A Vindication of the Rights of Men. And it was so well written and so well done, it became a bestseller. And this pamphlet was further defending the rights of those peasants to revolt and overthrow the king over there in France. And this was not only a bestseller in France, but across the ocean as well. It was considered to be something that was required reading for the Founding Fathers. Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, they had all read this pamphlet and influenced a lot of their thinking. And now Mary became quite famous, especially within the intelligentsia of England. And her circle of acquaintances included such notable people as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, the famous philosopher, David Hume, the famous scientist and philosopher Joseph Priestley. So the publisher wanted something follow-on, right? Because if you get a hit in anything, they wanted to follow on with something right away. So he was like, Mary, come on, I need something else, Mary wasn't quite sure what to write. So she sat back and thought and said, well, I wrote this thing about the vindication of the rights of the men, about these people who were subjugated and downtrodden. Well, you know something? Women have those same problems in society today. We're almost like second-class citizens, just as those peasants were treated in France. So she wrote a follow-on, which was looking at the same ideas, but from the standpoint of the subjugation of women. And it was called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at that time that she wrote that in the late 1700s, talking about the rights of women was kind of a bizarre phrase to use, because women didn't have any rights. They had no right to property. If the man died, he couldn't leave his property to women. It wasn't what legally couldn't even do it. He'd go to his family. She couldn't even inherit the children. If the husband died, the children went to the husband's family. It was only through their graces that they would give the children back to the mother. Even if the husband said, well, I'm going to write a will, and I'm going to put my wife in the will, a woman couldn't legally be a party to a contract. So it couldn't even be done that way. It had to be done just through goodwill to grant her things. Matter of fact, she didn't even have a legal right to her well-being, because at that time in England, it was legal to beat your wife with a stick. But the English were quite proper. They set up the rules such that, well, the stick had to be no larger than the diameter of your thumb. As long as it was that size or smaller, it was perfectly fine. So, I mean, when we had rights marches about women's rights in the 70s, and they were protesting things that seemed as innocuous as job opportunities and equal wages, oh my goodness, there was this huge pullback. There was all this hullabaloo. Could you imagine what happened or what the reaction was when Mary came out with that work back at those times in the late 1700s? It was a bestseller, not only among women, but among men as well. And you say, how in the world could that have been? And that was because it was, Mary laid this out in a very brilliant way, the way she laid out these arguments. What she did is she said, you know, this is a religious issue. God made both male and female in God's image. And she gave reason as a special gift from God. And that was very important, because at that time, most of the Protestant religions believed in a concept called deism, that God created the heavens and earth and did all this stuff, and then he went off to do other things, and he wasn't looking over everyone's shoulder. And he gave man the gift of reason, because that was the necessary thing he needed to lead a virtuous life. And people accepted the fact that education was needed to improve your reason. So Mary said, if you deny women education, you're denying them the ability to lead a virtuous life. That is an affront to God's plan. And it's a threat to the immortal soul of women. So if you're against this, you're against God and God's plan. She said this is a family issue as well. I mean, nobody likes manipulative wives and men out there. Well, if you give women education and improve their reason and make them independent, they'll be much more virtuous. They won't depend upon manipulation to get what they want. You'll have happier families, even better children they'll be able to raise. She said in her work, it is vain to expect virtue from women till they are in some degree independent of men. Whilst they are absolutely dependent on their husbands, they will be cunning, mean, and selfish. It would be an endless task to trace the variety of meanness, cares, and sorrows into which women are plunged by the prevailing opinion that they were created to feel rather than reason, and that all the power they obtain must be obtained by their charms and weaknesses. Make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives, that is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. She did this in a very non-confrontational way. She would say, battle of the sexes. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. So the men would read this and say, well, of course I want a happier marriage, I want a wife that's not going to browbeat me. So they buy into all of this stuff. Laid down very, very, very smart. So, now, Mary was here to fame and fortune. Two works that were, a work that was a bestseller. And the publisher rushed out another edition of this, subsequent editions, and she had Mary's name on this. So not only was she famous now for the vindication of the rights of men, but also for the vindication of the rights of women. And she became very famous and started accumulating a large amount of money. she dearly could have used her friend Fanny, because her personal life just started to come off the train tracks. She had an ill-advised infatuation with this artist, Henry Fuseli, who would paint these bizarre paintings with these kind of mythological creatures and all of this stuff. And Mary's carrying on with this fellow for months and months, and finally it comes out that he's married and he's got a wife. And he tells Mary, oh, don't worry, I'm in the process of getting a divorce, that's why I never mentioned this to you. Do any time now, you know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And they're going on, and so nothing's happening with the divorce. So at some point, Mary decides that she's going to take this into her own hands, and she goes calling on his wife. Wife knew nothing about this affair. Mary comes calling and gets the calling card, takes it up and serves some tea, and the wife says, well, how can I help you? And Mary goes on to explain, in a very calm manner, how she's been carrying on this affair with her husband for months, and lays out this logical argument on why she's a much better match for the husband and why she should divorce him so Mary can marry him. Oh, the wife blew up, gets the servant over and kicks her out of the house. I mean, what is this? And so Henry comes home, and the wife says, who is this woman? And Henry said, well, I don't know, I've never seen her before. Must be some deranged woman. But Mary was not to be dissuaded. She's some sort of obsessive person that I mentioned. And she decides to revisit the wife. And the wife figures, well, she's coming back to profusely apologize. You know, be supportive about this. So she sits down with Mary, and instead Mary lays out this big argument, an elaborate plan on how they could live as a threesome. Well, this time, the woman calls the police. This lady's deranged, right? The police coming out, all these big things happening, and then scandal, right? Press got hold of the paper. Famous Mary Wollstonecraft. Oh, the publisher was in a tizzy. Mary was his money bags, right? What do? Well, they do what they do now. You lay low. You lay low, but let the thing blow. So the publisher said, well, go out to the countryside. I want you to go out to the countryside for a few months, 6 months at least. Let the thing blow over and then come back and people forget about it. Let's go on to another story with the press. And Mary says, no, I got a better idea. I don't want to go to the countryside. Instead, I'm going to go to France. Right? All that great stuff is happening over there. And the publisher said, what do you mean great stuff? Why would you want to go to France? Don't you know, like, they got this big thing going, this reign of terror, and they're chopping off people's heads, and in case you hadn't heard, they don't like the English very much over there in France. Mary said, don't worry, no. I wrote this pamphlet, Vindication of the Rights of the Men. I'll get off the boat and they'll welcome me as a hero. So despite everyone's advice not to, she decides she's going to go to France. And she gets off the boat, and she finds out they never translated her pamphlet into French, and they had no idea who she was. And as an aristocratic type English woman, they were after her for the guillotine. And she went into hiding. And some family was hiding her for quite a while, but then they were worried about their own safety. And they said, I'm sorry, Mary, you're going to have to leave, within the next week or so. We can't, it's getting too close for comfort here. And Mary didn't know what to do, and it seemed like they were closing in on her location to get her for the guillotine. And at the last second, she was rescued by a dashing American. Because the Americans were okay in France at that time, because we were fellow revolutionaries. Right? And the dashing American was Gilbert Emily, Kentucky frontiersman. Well, he's a writer just like Mary. Marry me, he said. Come to America, because he thought Mary was just so wonderful. So they started kind of living together, and Mary wanted to get married, and he said, well, wait, I want to get married back in America, with my relatives and all around in our big house and our mansion over there and stuff. In the meantime, Mary got pregnant and was expecting a child. So Gilbert said, well, okay, we need to leave, but before we go, I need to finish up some of my business interests here over. So I'm going to take a quick trip to some other countries and come back, and we'll go to America and get married and all this. So Mary's waiting months and months and months, and there's no Gilbert. And she winds up giving birth to the child, which she named after her childhood friend, Fanny, this girl. Still no Gilbert. She's writing, and nothing's coming back in terms of letters. So finally, she finds out through the source that he's shacking up with this girl over in London. So she was able to scrape up enough money to go over to London. So what does she do? Well, she goes over there, and she kind of pulls the same thing she did with Fuseli's wife. That she goes over to confront this woman. Oh, by the way, this fellow Gilbert didn't quite turn out to be what he said he was. He wasn't a Kentucky frontiersman. He actually was never further west than New Jersey. He wasn't wealthy. He was heavily in debt, and he ran away from the United States to Europe to escape debtor's prison. The only thing he ever wrote was something Mary Ghost wrote for him. And the reason he took off around Europe is he had a string of women just like Mary in all of these different countries. So Mary goes over there and does the same thing. She confronts this actress that he was shacking up with. And she sits down and she lays out for this actress all these logical arguments on why she should leave him, Gilbert, and then, Mary should then marry him instead, and then the actress would have nothing of this. And at the same time, before she was done with the actress, Gilbert walks in the door. And he announces to Mary, "No, I'm sorry, I'm staying with this actress, things are over." And Mary was just totally distraught, emotional. She went back home and she drank a bottle of laudanum, the morphine-type substance in those days. Got very, very ill, but it didn't kill her, right? But the press got news of it because she was back in town and she was hospitalized for trying to commit suicide. Big scandal was hitting it. So now Gilbert got under pressure because all these reporters are knocking on the door, saying, "What's going on here with this Mary Wollstonecraft? What did you do to try to have her commit suicide and all of this?" So he needed to kind of get rid of her. So he said, well, Mary, I've got some further business interests I want to do in Scandinavia. And Mary had access to her funds now that she was back in England, because she had quite a bit of money on what she wanted. Mary, you can take some of your money and you go on a trip over to these different countries in Scandinavia and report back to me on kind of what it's like over there, the cultural things, the economics, so I can understand what type of businesses is set up there. So she goes there with her child and goes on this big tour of all these countries in Scandinavia. And every place she stops, she's sending back letters to Gilbert describing what it's like there. The people, the culture, all kind of scores and scores of letters. And in between these descriptions of the cities and countries, she's got these pleas, take me back, please take me back, this is why you should take me back. So she completes this tour, and then she goes back to Gilbert, and Gilbert tells her, "No, thank you for doing this tour for me, but it's over, Mary. Goodbye, have a wonderful life, we're finished." And Mary was just crushed. And she goes to commit suicide. And she went to the Thames Bridge, and she stood at the very edge of the bridge. She took a breath and she looked up, and then she jumped. And she didn't calculate that she had this giant hoop skirt contraption. So if she hit the water, it formed like this giant air bubble. And she just kind of floated like this on top of the water, like in this big bubble. And she started going downstream on this big bubble, and she's going like this, and finally she kind of tipped over the water, and these fishermen come and they pull her up with a wet rag. And they took her over to this tavern, and they dry her off, and said, "That's the famous Mary Wollstonecraft," somebody said, a big pressing scandal. And then so finally, Mary wakes up and smells the coffee. She goes back to Gilbert and says, "We're done." And she did another smart thing. She says, "I want all of my letters back. I sent you every single letter." So she takes all these letters back, and she edits out all the different pleas she put in there. Come back to me, Gilbert. And instead, she published them as a book. Mary Wollstonecraft's letters from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And this book became her most successful bestseller of all time, because she invented a new literary genre that was unheard of up until that time, the travelogue. I mean, we take it for granted when we see travelogues. We watch them on TV all the time, where some guy going to Europe and describing a city or books. But she was the very first one who came up with the idea of someone vicariously traveling to another country by taking you on this little personal tour, virtual tour of the country. So all of a sudden, boom, she was on top and making more money than she ever did before, and she finally found quickly some happiness in her love life. She got reacquainted with a fellow, he was a poet, William Godwin, that she had originally met in one of those round table dinners a long time ago from Reverend Price. And she was doing well and was quite happy. But unfortunately, the happiness was short-lived because she was expecting a child with William Godwin. And when she gave birth to the child, there was difficulty clearing the afterbirth. And they called in a physician at that time to help, which wasn't probably a great idea because physicians never washed their hands or their instruments. She developed a massive septic infection, and she wound up dying at age 38 in 1797. Now, Mary had the one child from Gilbert, Fanny, and then the child survived that she gave birth to when she died from the septic infection. And that was, and William named it after her mother, Mary. William thought that the children should have some type of mother, and so he married this woman, a widow, who turned out to be a very shrewish type person. She was quite mean, and she never accepted Fanny. She thought she was an illegitimate child and really shouldn't even be in the household. And she made life so miserable for Fanny that Fanny wound up committing suicide at age 17. Mary wound up running away from home because the household was so poor, and such a poor environment there at the household. And she ran off and eloped suddenly with the poet Percy Shelley, and of course many people know Mary today. Yeah, that's the Mary Shelley that wrote Frankenstein. Now, to honor Mary, Paul did a lot of work and wrote a biography of her. But he was a little bit clueless in that he included everything. Everything he included. Oh, these issues with the scandal with Fuseli and the fact that she gave birth to this Fanny without a husband and all of these other things. And now it is perfectly acceptable to do tell-all biographies, not in those days. So people were just completely shocked. And as a result, all of her previous works as a publisher were largely rejected. Even though many, many people used her work and took passages from it, she was never given credit. Future writers, including the Big Three, by the way, often used and borrowed her ideas, but she was rarely or never credited. She was an unknown. She was mostly, her sole claim to fame for the longest time was just the mother of the famous Mary Shelley. Matter of fact, I was watching Jeopardy last year, and they had a question on Jeopardy. Who was the mother of Mary Shelley? Okay? Mary Wollstonecraft. But fortunately, with the advance of women's studies in the 1970s, different feminist scholars had closely examined her work in the vindication of the rights of women, and they see that as the seminal work establishing feminist philosophy, and many of the principles that led to the arguments for women's suffrage, and that's why she holds the title of the mother of women's rights. Now, Mary, at her time, could write about her ideas, but she couldn't speak about them. No, couldn't go on a writer's book tour or anything like that. That's because famous women orators prior to 1830 didn't exist, because it was forbidden for women to speak in public. They were forbidden from speaking outside the home. If they were to speak inside the home, they were forbidden to speak to a mixed audience. They could only speak to an audience of women. And if they spoke inside the home to an audience of women, they could not discuss anything that was political or controversial. Just something like, how to do needlepoint or some other type of thing. Now, some women attempted this prior to 1830. There was an English utopian reformer by the name of Frances Wright, who tried to go on a short lecture tour, but was mocked horribly. That little cartoon there is a picture of her dressed as a goose, and it says, a downright gabbler or a goose that deserves to be hissed. So she was unsuccessful. And then there was an African-American woman by the name of Maria Stewart, who went out to speak about abolition and women's rights, and she only lasted 4 lectures. 3 black churches and 1 black Masonic hall,
and she announced at the end of the 4 lectures that, no, I can't do this. I made myself contemptible in the eyes of many by attempting to speak in public as a woman. Well, there were a couple of spunky gals that shattered this glass ceiling big time, and that was the Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters, between 1836 and 1837, went on a 23-week speaking tour in 67 cities, addressed over 40,000 people, spoke in large auditoriums like Boston's Odeon Hall that fit 3,000 people, and were the first women to address the legislative body, the Massachusetts legislature, and they did all of this under considerable duress. Well, what did they speak about on this big tour? Well, they spoke about abolition of slavery, and then increasingly on the tour, more and more of their talks started speaking about women's rights. And they were very odd speakers to be talking about abolition of slavery because they grew up on a South Carolina slave plantation. Yeah, they grew up on what's called the Magnolia Plantation. And it was quite a big household if you look at the Grimke children. There was Sarah and Angeline who went on the speaking tours. Sarah was not the first child or the second or the third. She was the 4th child. And Angelina was not the 5th child or the 6th or the 7th or 8th or the 9th or 10th or the 11th or 12th or the 3rd. She was the 14th child. And 11 of these children survived. So needless to say, by the time Angelina came along, the mother was quite tired. And Sarah became the godmother, but also was kind of responsible for raising Angelina, right? So Angelina called her real birth mother, and called Sarah mom. That's how closely Sarah was raising Angelina. Now, Sarah, who was raising Angelina, was not a good fit at all in Southern society at that time. She had ambitions to be a lawyer like her one brother, and they laughed and said, well, women can't become a lawyer. And she was continually doing things like trying to teach the slave children how to read and write, and they didn't allow them. They would continually be punishing Sarah for doing this type of thing. So after a time, when Angelina got older, Sarah decided to leave because she wasn't fitting in there down south, and she wanted to be in a more progressive society, so she left to move to Philadelphia. Now, even though Angelina was raised by Sarah, in some ways they were kind of like opposites because Angelina was the ideal fit in Southern high society. I mean, the first off, she was like the baby of the family, so she was always the center of attention, kind of a drama queen. But, I mean, she was very good at dancing, and she could play these different instruments, and she could recite poetry. She loved poetry, and she was a very good dancer, and she knew how to make witty conversation, and she had a long line of beaux courting her and such. She was a great fit. Now, when you look at this plantation, and you always think of these things on television where people are sitting on their front porch of the plantation, looking out on the working fields, that wasn't really true for the vast majority of plantations down south. Most of the time, the plantation house was miles away from the working fields. And Sarah and Ashley never really saw a slave working in the field. But they got a lot of exposure to slaves in terms of being the household servants, both at the plantation and at their summer house, which was in Charleston, the city of Charleston, because it was closer to the ocean and it was cooler in the summer. And this is what it looked like in 1860. It actually still exists today as a bed and breakfast. But they distinctly remember how many of the household slaves were abused. Angelina can remember how her one brother beat one of the household servants so badly that she actually jumped out of this 3rd-story window to get away home with breaking her legs. And also, Angelina remembers that she was tutoring some children, and their home was right next to what was called the slave workhouse. In those days, if you didn't have the stomach to punish your own slaves, you would send them to the workhouse where they would punish the slaves for you. And they had various ways of whipping them or forcing them to turn this big wheel, and if you fell down, then it would wrap on your shins, and just horrible treatment. And she could distinctly remember hearing the cries of these slaves in the workhouse. So after a while, Sarah began writing these letters back to Angelina, and Angelina wanted to kind of start modeling more her adopted mom. So Sarah was saying how she left her Episcopal church and now was going to join a more progressive Presbyterian, and Angelina down there in South Carolina decided to do the same thing, much to the consternation of her family. And then Sarah wrote a letter back saying that she decided to join an even more progressive church, the Quakers. They were more into abolition and these different causes. And Angelina went to try to do the same thing, which was not easy to find Quakers down in South Carolina. But she finally did. And she went into the church there, and she sat down, and there were two men. And they sat down on one side of the church and one on the other side. And they sat in complete silence and got up and left. And she came back, and they did the same thing the next week. So she asked somebody, and they said, well, those two Quaker men had a fight about 10 years ago, and they're not on speaking terms. So they kind of just sit on the church, and Quakers are supposed to not have a preacher, they're supposed to get up and preach themselves. So they just sit there in silence for the hour, and then they leave. But Angelina kept at it, and she got into these principles of abolition, which were a very difficult thing to have down in South Carolina. And she started lecturing her family and her friends and neighbors about the evils of slavery. And you can imagine how this went over. And it caused a great deal of friction. So, at some point, Angelina decided she was going to model her adopted mom and then go up and follow her to Philadelphia. And despite all the problems Angelina was causing down there, her family still didn't want her to go because she was the baby of the family, right? The center of attention. But Angelina went anyhow. And so she joined Sarah, and they joined a very progressive group of Quakers called the Hicksites, who were really, really into abolition. So Sarah and Angelina would read the leading abolitionist newspaper of that day that was published by William Lloyd Garrison called The Liberator. And Angelina thought this paper was marvelous, and she decided to write a letter to the editor, sticking up for him, giving him a pep talk. And the letter, Garrison liked this letter so much, he put it on the front page of The Liberator. And she wrote, because Angelina was into all this poetry, so she had this way of writing that was very dramatic. So in the letter to the editor, she wrote, "The ground upon which you stand is holy ground. Never, never surrender it. If you surrender it, the hope of the slave is extinguished. This is a cause worth dying for." Oh, and people loved this letter, the way she wrote this. And Garrison actually had to rush out another edition of this paper with Angelina's letter in there. Now, they became known as celebrated abolitionist writers. And Sarah put out a pamphlet, an epistle to the clergy of the southern states, urging clergymen in the South to speak against slavery. And Angelina came out with a pamphlet, appealed to the Christian women of the South for women to lobby their husband and teach their husbands about the evil of slavery. Well, the leaders of the abolitionist movement liked the work they were doing. And they had a speaker training school. And for abolitionist speakers, you go to this training school before they sent them out on the circuit. And they said, what if we train these two gals? Now, we don't want them speaking in public, that's not allowed, but what they could do is hold some tea parties in their home. And they could invite some women into these tea parties, and then they could give them some talks about abolition. So they went through the speaker training, and Sarah and Angelina started inviting ladies in their home, and they got so popular they couldn't fit them in their home. And they had to go into larger homes, and they couldn't even fit them into larger homes, and then those two gals had the temerity to actually rent a public venue. And so they went into a public hall and invited all these ladies, and it got packed, and men got real curious what was going on, and they started sneaking into the hall. And before they knew it, they were speaking there in Philadelphia to mixed audiences in a public place. And they decided to themselves, well, we've spoken to everybody we could speak to in Philadelphia, let's organize a public speaking tour. And they had the function to organize this speaking tour where they were going to invite men and women, and the same thing for them to address, and they booked large public venues. And this speaking tour turned out to be a sensation. A sensation. And you say to yourselves, how could this be? Because it was only 3 or 4 years before this that I spoke about those other women that were laughed off the stage. Why were they so successful where those other ladies failed? Well, what drew the big audiences were a couple of things. One of them was that they were unique as abolition speakers because they were former slave owners. And people flocked to hear from the horse's mouth what slavery was really like. And that's something they didn't have access to. But the thing that packed them and kept them coming was that they were spellbound by Angelina's speaking prowess. Angelina turned out to be one of the finest orators in American history. She was not a big gal, she was pretty small, but she had a huge, huge voice. She could easily fill a large hall of 1,000 people with her voice. And she would write these very dramatic, poetic speeches. I mean, she was used to being the baby of the family, center of attention drama queen, right? This was her element. So what would happen would be, Sarah would start out in the warm-up act, so to speak. And she'd stand up and give a fairly dry talk with facts and figures, but everybody would wait for Angelina to hit the stage. And she was a small gal, and she would come out dressed in like a plain Quaker gray outfit with a white bonnet. She had black curly hair, and she had these blazing blue eyes. And she would walk out, and there'd be this hush. And then say when she'd start off speaking, there would be like a fire coming out of her, that she would just get so much into this. And so she would start out and hit the stage and say, I stand before you as a Southerner, exiled from the land of my birth by the sound of the lash and the piteous cry of the slave. I stand before you as a repentant slaveholder. I owe it to the suffering slave, to the deluded master, to my country, and to the world to do all that I can to overturn a system of complicated crimes built upon the broken hearts of my countrymen in chains and cemented by the blood and sweat and tears of my sisters in bonds. And all the people will be on the edge of their seat listening to Angelina. Now, they did this tour and they were packing houses. But while this was going on, they were getting a harassment attack from all sides. All the local newspapers were speaking out against these women who had the temerity to speak in public, breaking these social mores. They were attacked by the clergy. They were booking churches originally, some of the public speaking places, and the churches all canceled, didn't allow them to speak there. And the clergymen were giving sermons forbidding their parishioners from going out and seeing any of these talks. And even the fellow abolitionists were speaking out against them. Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know the one that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin? She wrote excoriating articles in the paper against these women, disgracing the abolitionist movement by going out and having the gall to speak in public. Plus, angry mobs. These mobs would gather outside the hall, and they continually tried to disrupt or prevent their speeches. There were threats of violence, and they would try to shut them down, and they would throw rocks and bricks through the window. For example, when they tried to speak in this newly built Pennsylvania hall, they were the first people to speak there. The hall was just completed like a week or two before them. So they went to speak, and Angelina started speaking, and this big mob wound up surrounding the hall. They found out what was going on. And so there were all of these loose bricks from the building, you know, they were putting it up. And pretty soon, all those bricks started flying through every single window in the hall. So the people in the hall were kind of panicking, and they all rushed to the center aisle, you know, from this glass. And Angelina could write good speeches, but she was pretty good at speaking extemporaneously as well. And she jumped up on a table in the middle of all this, and she shouted out, "What is a mob? What would the breaking of every window be? What would the leveling of this hall be? Any evidence that we are wrong, or that slavery is a good and wholesome institution?" And then the Grimke sisters had to get everybody out of there, so they were worried because they had African-American people there. So they organized these kind of two lines, like a cordon to protect them. They kind of shepherded them out of the hall. And then they got out in the hall quickly, burned the place down to the ground. Brand new hall. And to show what kind of support or protection she had from the fire and the police, they let the thing burn to the hall. They didn't even try to put it out. So you say to yourselves, well, how could they persevere through all of this, right? Why didn't they give up and they kept on this, so many other people kind of gave up through these threats? Well, that's because they had something deeply in common with another set of siblings. The Blues Brothers.
For me and the Lord, we've got an understanding. We're on a mission from God. Putting the band back together. We did it. No, we're on a mission from God. Matt, you know, put the band back together.
Man, you gotta understand, this is a lot bigger than the domestic problems you might be experiencing.
Would it make you feel any better if you knew that what we're asking Matthew to do is a holy thing?
You see, we're on a mission from God.
First you trade the Cadillac for a microphone, then you lie to me about the band, now you're gonna put me right back in the joint.
They're not gonna catch us. We're on a mission from God. 106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses.
Yeah, as far as the Grimke sisters were concerned, they were very religious, and they felt their speaking tour was a mission from God. And woe be anybody who was going to get in the way of that mission. So the more they got pushed and criticized for speaking in public, the more they pushed back about the woman's right to speak. And Sarah would write different pamphlets about it, and Angelina increasingly in her talks about abolition would include large sections about the woman's rights to speak. And Angelina would say, the time to assert a right is the time when that right is denied. We must establish this right to speak, for if we do not, it would be impossible for us to go on with the work of emancipation. Now, while they were on this tour, they were also collecting petition names for a legislative act condemning slavery. So they presented this petition to the Massachusetts legislature for reading this petition in the Massachusetts legislature. And one of the legislators said, well, why don't you come and read this to the legislature yourself? But the Speaker of the legislature was dead set against it. He would not allow it, but he got overruled by so many members wanting it. So they were scheduled to be the very first woman to speak before a legislative body. And the day that they were supposed to go over there, it turned out that Sarah was sick in bed with a very high fever, and she just could not come to accompany Angelina. And Angelina was terrified, because even though she was this drama queen and center of attention, she always had Sarah there as her wingman right behind her. And she was going to have to go all by herself, right? So they pick Angelina up to go talk to the legislature and to present this petition of 20,000 women's signatures to abolish slavery. And Angelina gets there, and her knees are like shaking, and the place was packed. There were so many people packed into this legislature, they actually had all of the aisles jammed up that she could not get in the front door. She actually had to get in through a window here, come in through the window and then come up here. The Speaker would not allow her to speak at the podium. He said, I'm not going to allow this. If you want to talk, you can just stand at the edge of the balcony. So Angelina got up to the edge of the balcony. She looks out at all these people, and there's no Sarah there. And the people said that she just got white as a ghost. And she looked pretty unsteady, like she was just going to fall over and pass out. But all of a sudden, she kind of steadied herself. And that fire came into her eyes. And she composed this brilliant speech for the occasion. And she drew an analogy to the story of Esther in the Bible, where Esther infiltrates the harem of the king to save the Jewish people. So she shouted out before the legislature, more than 2,000 years have rolled their dark and bloody waters down the rocky, winding channel of time into the broad ocean of eternity, since woman's voice was heard in the palace of an Eastern monarch, and women's petition achieved the salvation of millions of her race from the edge of the sword. And then she went on to say, I, like Esther, I heard her, give another petition to save another race of people. And the talk was just phenomenally well received. And the Speaker of the House was so moved by this talk that he invited her back to speak the next day. And the hall was packed again with all of these other people that wanted to see the speech. And this time the Speaker insisted that Angelina stand at his speaker podium of the Speaker of the House to give that talk to the legislature and these other people. Well, shortly after this, Angelina got married to another fellow abolitionist by the name of Theodore Well. And Sarah and Angelina did most of the research to help him publish a periodical that became very, very sold and famous. It was called American Slavery as It Is. And the idea was first-hand accounts of slavery. Because one of the reasons Sarah and Angelina were so popular on the speaking tour, it was coming from the horse's mouth. So he wanted to compile actual stories of slavery. So Sarah and Angelina contributed what they knew, plus they researched all these newspapers from the South to get articles and such. And it became quite a bestseller on the abolitionist story. Matter of fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, knew nothing about the lives of slaves. And she used that periodical to write all of the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's ironic, she was the one that was blasting the Grimke sisters for going on this speaking tour. Now, Angelina, in very quick order, gave birth to 3 children. And they had some massive domestic challenges which kind of put the kibosh on their speaking tour. Because when they were growing up, they were waited on hand and foot by all of these servants. And all of a sudden they had a household with 3 children and all these visitors coming in. And back in those days, there was no Wegmans to run into for a quick meal, and there were no microwaves, and there were no dishwashers. You had to know a lot of stuff to run a household. And they knew nothing, and they were overwhelmed, to say the least. So they had their hands full just running this household. And they were adequate, but not the greatest domestic people. I mean, people that came to visit said, well, the food was kind of borderline, and the place tended to be kind of a mess, but they got by. But they still kept their hand in different things. In March 1870, in Lexington, Massachusetts, Sarah, when age 77, and Angelina at age 65, led a group of 42 women through a snowstorm and a crowd of angry men to cast ballots in the general election. When did Susan B. Anthony vote again? 1872, yeah. Susan B. Anthony wasn't the first. Grimke sisters were there. And they found out that they had long-lost relatives. It turns out that one of their brothers back on the plantation, after the wife died, he took one of the slaves as a mistress and fathered some children with him. And so he laid out in his will that those children were to be taken care of, but the family reneged on it. So when the Grimke sisters found out, they brought the children back up north to take care of them and get them educated. And the one child, Francis Grimke, turned out to be the first African American to go to Princeton University, graduated and became a very famous clergyman. The other child, Archibald Grimke, became the first African American to go through the Harvard Law School and became the first head of the NAACP. Archibald's daughter, who he named after Angelina, became one of the most famous poets of the Harlem Renaissance. So, whenever you ladies have an opportunity to stand up and speak in public, you should give a little silent thanks to those spunky Grimke sisters who wrote that glass ceiling and gave you that right. Now, the last lady I'd like to speak about is Victoria Woodhull, who's also known as Mrs. Satan, also known as Notorious Victoria, also known as the Terrible Siren. What did she do to get these nicknames? Well, her story begins in 1838 over in Homer, Ohio. And she was born to a couple of pretty bizarre parents. Her mother, Annie Claflin, was kind of an odd sort that would go into these religious trances, was big into spiritualism. Many people felt she was kind of borderline mentally unstable. The father was Reuben Buck Claflin. And the nicest thing I could find written about him in my research was somebody said he looked like a sneak in a skinflint. Any nefarious thing that was around, whether it was stealing people at horse trading or robbing anything that wasn't nailed down, I mean, he was involved with it. They say his only claim to fame, or his only skill, real skill in life, was siring beautiful daughters. And Victoria was one of them. She was daughter number 3, born in 1838. Named her after Queen Victoria, who was kind of famous at that time. So good old Buck figures, well, I need to make a living here. Why don't I just marry off my good-looking daughters to some nice wealthy men and I'll live off of that. So at the tender age of 15, he sets up Victoria with this quote-unquote wealthy doctor, Dr. Canning Woodhull. Turns out he was not a real doctor. He was a drunk, a womanizer, a morphine addict. Basically had this kind of mail order degree. He said he was a doctor in Ohio at that time, because at that time, Ohio did not have laws requiring licensing of doctors. He just kind of faked it. So he very quickly got Victoria pregnant. And Victoria wound up getting abandoned by him just when she was close to giving birth. He was off on a morphine binge, who left her in some kind of Yankee hotel to give birth to this child, which he had to do with like no assistance. And Victoria's writing home to her family to give her help. And finally her mother came over with a couple of her sisters. And they found her and this baby in this unheated hotel room, and there were actually icicles hanging from the bedpost. So both of them were extremely ill, and then the child wound up being mentally challenged. And Victoria always blamed the horrible prenatal care and situation she was in for her son's condition. She wrote and said her son was followed by a drunk and born in squalor. Well, she had another child shortly after that, and then she had to support her children because the husband was basically never there. It was always gone. So she went and left him and traveled over to San Francisco to try to take care of her children. So she needed to support her family, so she got a job, and somebody said, well, you're a nice looking gal, why don't you be a cigar store gal? You stand in front of the cigar store and you attract people in there. And then she did this, and then at night, to get enough money for her children and such, she worked all night as a seamstress. So she had a job as a seamstress where she was working on costumes for a theater company. And the theater manager came up to pick up the costumes and said, hey, you got a really nice voice, and you're a nice looking gal. You consider being on the stage. Now, at that time, being an actress was not a reputable profession for a woman, but she needed the money. And she went on the stage, and she was very good at it. And she became a very successful stage actress in the San Francisco area. And she brought in quite a bit of money. She was brought in what would be equivalent today of about maybe $75,000 a year. Doing well, she was able to buy a home, get nanny and nursing help for her children, and she one day heard this knock on her door. And opened the door, and who was there? Good old Buck! Buck heard that she had money. Buck heard that she was doing well, and Buck brought along the whole family behind her. Hey, they were all going to go there and live off with old Victoria, who was doing well. And Victoria wasn't too crazy about this. Buck said, oh, don't worry. See, all I need is some money for you, and I got this patent medicine show. You know, give me some money to fund the patent medicine show, and then, you know, we won't have to be living in your home if you kind of go out. So, Buck goes out with a couple of the daughters on the patent medicine show, and before he left, he decided he needed some more money, and he stole a whole bunch of money from the theater's box office. So he takes off with the other daughter, Tennessee, they called her Tenny, and they were pumping this wonderful elixir. It was called Miss Tennessee's Magneto Life Elixir. And Tennessee would go out there, and Tennessee wasn't the greatest speaker, but she had a great figure. So when they got crowds of men, one of the newspapers wrote, she wasn't much of a speaker, but she got some pretty good crowds because she displayed a wondrous shirt front. So then someone made the mistake of actually drinking this stuff and got deathly ill. And the police came after them, and they escaped, and they came back to San Francisco. Victoria, help us out, you know, da-da-da. And by this time, Victoria had lost her job as an actress because the theater found out about the stolen money from her father. So they had to come up with something, and Victoria had this idea, since the mother was into spiritualism, to get into the spiritualism business. Formed the Magnetic Healing Institute, the Conservatory of Metaphysical, Mental, and Spiritual Science. And they went in with Tenney on this. They were spiritualists. And they did okay, but San Francisco wasn't exactly a thriving metropolis at that time, so they needed to go someplace where there were more people, more money that could finance this spiritualism bracket they were into. So they decided to move cross-country to New York. And they decided to go where there was a lot of money in New York and where people wanted to see the future. And where would that be? Well, over then, Wall Street, right? A lot of wealthy people there, a lot of people that want to know what's going to be going on in the future. So she set up her spiritualism business, and one of the first clients they had was a very key king of Wall Street who was into spiritualism. And that was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who liked Victoria and was just enhanced by good old Tennessee. Tenney was so cute. So he would regale the tales about tales of Wall Street and these brokers and how they were clueless and all this other stuff. And Victoria was very ambitious, and she said, well, why can't, we go into this female brokerage business, form our own female brokerage? And Cornelia said, well, there aren't female brokers, but these guys are clueless, you could probably do as well as anybody else. I'll tell you what, I'll set you up in business. Give you a little bit of money, and I'll give you some tips to get started. So they set up this first female brokerage business. Now, by this time, Victoria had remarried a fellow by the name of James Carter Blood, and they kind of put him in the back to kind of do the books, and they were kind of the front people. But it was very difficult to attract new clients because nobody wanted to go to female brokers. So Victoria had some tips and some money, but she said, what am I going to do? I need some clients. So maybe there's some women I could find that have money that want to invest. I'll come to a women's brokerage. So where can I find some women with money? Oh, I got it. These uptown bordellos. There's all these madams there. They've got a bunch of cash they're probably not investing in. So she approached all these madams to invest the money in her brokerage. And then she said to these madams, by the way, I'm sure you have a lot of these stockbrokers that are clients. Can you get your prostitutes, your gals, to give stock tips from them and feed it back to our firm? And she set up this system where she got the money, right? And then she got the stock tips coming in from these stock that the prostitutes were getting, and she started doing pretty good. And then she started faking it even more, spending money they didn't have to get over their offices to make it look like they were really doing great. But what they really did well was there was a run on the market that they were expecting. And Vanderbilt gave them tips in terms of how to play this run on the market. So they weren't allowed into the stock exchange, but they parked their carriage outside it and they sent in these runners. And when the run on the market happened, they were able to take advantage of it. And they cornered it. They cornered the market. And they brought in a large amount of money. In today's dollars, it was about over $300,000, but in today's dollars, they made about $15 million in that one day, cornering the market. And then all of a sudden, they were really on the map and they became famous. They started playing it up to the press. They started dressing as men. Cut their hair short. Here's Victoria and here's Tennessee, kind of wearing men's clothes. And there were all kinds of articles in the papers. Here's even a cartoon that was in the New York Evening Telegraph. And it shows the queens of finance. And then here they are whipping and driving the bears and bulls of Wall Street, trampling the other brokers under their feet. And they had more business than they knew what to do with now in their brokerage business. And they were quite successful and quite profitable. Now, Victoria was quite ambitious, and one of the things she really respected was newspaper publishers and editors. So she decided that she wanted to start her own paper, the Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. Now, she hired a person to be the main editor because Victoria was interested in reform movements, so she hired this guy that was way out there in terms of being a reformist, Stephen Pearl Andrews. One of the first things he published in this paper was he was the first people to publish in the United States the first translation in America of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And Victoria didn't write that well, but she would dictate these things that her husband would then kind of clean up the writing on and make these editorial contributions, mostly on things having to do with reform issues, workers' rights, child labor laws, and increasingly women's rights she would speak about. And she was very interested in writing about a particular idea. Now, at that time, Susan B. Anthony was toiling away in Washington, trying to get her paper going, the revolution, and convincing people to pass the 16th Amendment to get women's suffrage. But that amendment was basically just stuck in congressional committee, and she could not get the time of day of anybody in Congress to let her into an office and speak and try to lobby for this. But along came another lady who said, "You're wasting your time, Susan," and that was Virginia Minor. And she came up with the concept of the New Departure Strategy in 1870. And she said, we don't need this 16th Amendment. We already have the right to vote, because we've already passed the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, it says that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens, so all women are citizens. And it says you cannot deny to citizens based upon race, color, or previous conditions of servitude the right to vote. Well, we've been in this condition of servitude now for generations. So as being citizens in conditions of servitude, we now have the right to vote. And, Victoria took this to heart, started writing about it in a newspaper, and she led a contingent of women, and they stormed the polls in 1871 to cast their ballot. When did Susan B. do her voting thing? 1870, yeah, both Victoria and the Grimke sisters voted before Susan B. She wasn't the first. She wasn't the first. Well, meantime, Tenney made friends with Benjamin Butler, who was a famous Civil War general, but then became the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And Benjamin was quite enchanted by Tenney. And he liked this idea of, they had these new ideas about women voting. And he said, well, why don't you come and present your ideas to the Judiciary Committee? And they did. And in 1871, Victoria and Tenney and a couple of other ladies became the first women to address a congressional committee. Very first time. And they laid out their ideas on why women already had the right to vote. And this was seen as quite the achievement and quite the advance for women's rights. And many people were enthused about it, but not everybody was. Somebody was really burned and angry about this. Oh, Susan B. She couldn't get the time of day with Congress. And these hussies come in and not only get time with Congress, but mixing her idea of the 16th Amendment that it wasn't even needed. But she would never say this in public, because her paper, The Revolution, was folding for lack of funds, and she wanted funds from Victoria, because Victoria had a lot of money. So in public, she would say that Victoria, she was impressed by her money, brains, and unceasing energy. That's not how she felt behind the scenes. So now that Victoria was speaking to Congress, she had even stronger ambitions. And she announced shortly after that she was going to run for President of the United States for the 1872 election. I now announce myself as candidate for the presidency. I anticipate criticism, but however unfavorable, I trust my sincerity will not be called into question. And you can imagine she got attacked. One of the big people that attacked her was our good friend, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who attacked the Grimke sisters and then used their works for propaganda. What did she write about Victoria's presidential bid? No woman that was not willing to be dragged through every kennel and slapped into every dirty pail of water like an old mop would ever consider to run as a candidate. While it's an ordeal that kills a man. And what sort of brazen tramp of a woman would it be that could stand it and come out of it without being killed? would it be any kind of woman that we should want to see at the head of our government? Well, this didn't sway Victoria, right? She formed her Equal Rights Party. She named as her running mate. Does anybody know? Stephen Douglas. Yeah, he didn't know it. She just said it. And Stephen Douglas was her running mate. And her platform was one of women's rights. It was a platform of social reform. And it was also a platform of free love. Well, it appeared to be more salacious than it was. And she didn't fully explain it on her speech flyers because it would draw in a big audience. But really what she would be getting at when she would talk about it was that she was talking about the unfair situation of marriage at that time. That women were a prisoner of economics. They couldn't get a job to support themselves if they left the marriage. They couldn't inherit any money. They were trapped by economics into the marriage. And they were legally disadvantaged. They spoke. They couldn't inherit anything from the husband if he died or left the marriage. Couldn't even get the children. There was this hypocrisy that if the marriage wasn't going well, it was perfectly okay for the husband to have affairs, to have mistresses, to visit prostitutes. Yet if a woman did any of that, they would be scorned by society. And she felt all of this harms the children. Look what happened to her poor child that became mentally challenged because of this abuse she took from this husband that she could not leave. But, again, on her posters and stuff, she would kind of play up the salacious line to get the audience. Well, what happened then was that she said, by the way, in her writings on this, women cannot bear their best children, except by the men they love best, and for whom they have the keenest desire. So that's what she's talking about in terms of love. Now, there was a preacher who was heavily criticizing this free love policy of Victoria, Henry Ward Beecher. He was like the Jimmy Swaggart of his day. I mean, he was the big guy in Boston. Packed these people into his Plymouth church to give his talks. So he started laying into Victoria for her candidacy and her policy of free love. But Victoria found out that this Henry Ward Beecher, she actually found this out from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was having an affair with this guy's wife. And she wound up publishing articles about this in her newspaper to get back at this guy that was criticizing her. And this later led to this huge civil trial, where it was this trial of the century, almost like the OJ trial, about Tilden suing this guy for seducing his wife and all these cartoons and such about it. But before the trials took place, Beecher tried to defend himself and push back against Victoria by having her arrested. He talked the district attorney into having her arrested under something called the Comstock Law, which was sending out speeding materials through the mail. Because when he made this convoluted argument, the district attorney did that, well, she's making this claim to this salacious affair, but the affair hasn't been proven in court, so because of that reason it's fiction, so she's sending fiction of a salacious affair, so that's borne out. And they threw her in the clink. She spent all of this money on lawyers getting out and getting rearrested again. And at some point, she was trying to be kind of rescued by Tilden's wife, who had the affair. And she felt that if the story got out that this affair was true, by some source, then it would prove that this was not fiction and Victoria could get free. And so she tried to go to somebody to get the message out. And there are many researchers who felt that the person she went to go to was Susan Anthony. And sat down with Susan Anthony, heard all this, and took all these notes and all of this stuff, and thanked Elizabeth profusely, and said, okay, I'll see what I can do. And Elizabeth went, and Susan Anthony took all of her notes and just crumpled them up in garbage, and let go of Victoria twist in the wind. And she finally got freed of this, but not before it exhausted all of her money and crashed her presidential campaign. And actually, it turned out, they found out many decades later, when they looked at the accurate birth records, she was actually a couple months shy of being old enough to be president of the United States. So some people say she wasn't officially the first presidential candidate because of that, but I figured, no, she was really the first presidential candidate. Crashed her brokerage firm, and crashed the newspaper, and even crashed her marriage. But she was quite resourceful. And she regathered herself, and she took herself and her sister, and she went over to England, and got back into the seance business. And started becoming the seance of some wealthy aristocracy. And was able to mingle then with London's upper class. And Tenny wound up marrying and becoming the Viscountess of Montserrat. And Victoria wound up shortly married after that, married John Woodall Martin, the most wealthy banker in all of England. And at that time, England had laws where the wife could inherit the husband's fortune. And about a year after they married, good old John Woodall dropped dead. Left all the money to Victoria. And Victoria became one of the wealthiest women in England. And she was heavily involved in many types of social causes, set up these schools and education to better educate women, tried to do these new things in agriculture, train women into different trades, got very heavily involved in World War I, into these different relief efforts for the soldiers, very interested in technology, was one of the first women in England to own a car. Here's a picture of her of age 87, racing around this estate in this automobile with her one daughter. This is Zulu, the other daughter, asking her to slow down. And that's the son that was mentally challenged. She lived to be 89 years old before she passed away. Now, it's very difficult when you look at Victoria's life to separate fact from fantasy, because she had so many enemies, and people would write up so much stuff about her. They would say, she was never a cigar store girl when she went to San Francisco. She was actually a prostitute. And when these free love lectures were going, she was saying all this salacious stuff. And it's very difficult to sort out an accurate picture on her life. But what we know is true is she is someone who did amazing accomplishments for a woman. She was the first woman to run for president. She was the first woman to become a Wall Street broker, and a very successful Wall Street broker at that. The first woman to address Congress. The first woman to become a successful publisher. So she was someone, and the first person actually in the United States to speak openly about issues of marriage and sexuality. She took a jackhammer to the glass ceiling. And historians, just like with Mary Wollstonecraft, said, well, because of her checkered past, what kind of role model is she? And she was never really cited or talked about very much. But, there was a speaker that came a couple of years ago from the University of Wisconsin, a professor, who majored in studying Susan B. Anthony and others. Her name was Ann Dexter Gordon. And in the talk here in Rochester, she said, to find inspiration in a historical figure is a complex task. We create a phantom person for our own modern persons out of odd bits of her life that we value. So she was saying we gotta put people on this kind of pedestal. Because in the United States, we want our heroes to be 100% good and our bad guys to be 100% bad, and we don't like the gray in between. Now, whether it's the gray of all the different personal life problems of Mary Wollstonecraft, or the fact that the Grimke sisters were slave owners, or that Victoria was involved in a lot of strange things, the prostitutes being stuffed at her brokerage firm, we don't deal with it well. But you have to keep in mind, there's no perfect women's rights heroine. Susan B. Anthony was far from a perfect person. And we should recognize women based upon their contributions, just like we do for the men, for our founding fathers. My goodness sakes, Benjamin Franklin had a string of women that he was seeing on the side. Alexander Hamilton made all of his money in a slave trading fund. Now, they left that part out of the musical, right? They didn't do a song on that. But we overlook all of that to recognize their accomplishments, yet we don't do it for the ladies, and we should do it. Because you'd be hard-pressed to find 4 ladies who contributed more to women's rights than the 4 ladies I spoke about today. Thank you very much for listening to me. Does anybody have any quick questions? Thank you. Okay, could we get the lights there so we don't trip over each other? You can wait till the lights come on, please.
I don't know that everybody knows,
Oh, yes.
but that Victoria married married Kenny Woodhall,
Right, the first husband.
who was the first son of Byron Woodhall, who was our town supervisor.
Right.
Our first town
The
supervisor.
first husband was originally from Rochester, New York, and he was related to the first town supervisor
Yeah.
of Westchester. Actually, one of the things that Victoria got heavily criticized for were after she married her second husband, she found out about the first husband that he was very ill and stuff and was working at it, and she took him in to care for him. Because she felt that he should, and she was heavily criticized for taking in the second husband and caring, the first husband and caring for him. And that's one of the things she was excoriated about. So she actually made peace with her second husband afterwards and helped him. Well, I'll stick around in case you have any questions. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the